All right, so we're going to do a French seam now. This is an actual finished sample. So there's the outside, and then on the inside you'll see it's just the fabric itself. There's no overlocking or anything. It means that you just need to do two lots of stitching. So we stitch this one at 4 mil like it says, and then the second one at 6 mil. So just getting started with our 4 mil, you can use this line here. So the right hand side of the dog feed, is that what it's called, Libby?
Feed dog.
Feed dog.
No.
Oh, is
Feed
it?
dog.
Feed dogs.
Yeah, don't feed them.
Don't feed them. Anyway,
Yes,
these
the
little
dog.
wobbly things here. Yeah, just along this edge here, and then from there to the
Feed dog.
to the needle is 4 millimeters. And just to get started too, if you're working generally, I wouldn't necessarily need to do it for this type of cotton, but if you're working with a fine fabric like a georgette or a chiffon or something, it's usually a good idea to pull both of the threads. So we've got the needle thread and the bobbin thread. I pull those up and pulling those towards the back, and that way you can hold on to those when you get started sewing. Push the fabric right under so it sits right under the needle, and then just hold on to the threads here and just do your little back tack. And it just means that otherwise, if you don't do this and you've just got the regular start, it can just make a big knot of thread underneath, and this stops that from happening. So I'm sewing along here, and I'm only just looking at where the edge of the fabric goes along this line. I'm not looking at the needle, because the needle's going to go up and down anyway. So we're just stitching. Okay, so there's our 4 millimeters there. Now, I did have the idea that the next thing would be to actually press this seam open, and it's probably easy enough to do in a cotton, but again in a chiffon or a georgette or something that might be a bit tricky, especially if it's starting to fray a little bit. So if you're working with a fabric like this, you can press the seam open. If not, press the seam to one side before we get started on the next row of stitching. So I'll just give this a press. Okay, so I've pressed this seam open, and you can see that the edge of the fabric is just fraying. Don't pull on those threads because you could end up with no seam allowance at all. Just trim them off as you go. So just snip them off, because the thing is, if you have these long threads hanging out, when you do the next row of stitching, you'll actually have threads coming out of this finished edge here. So now we're going to fold it in half, and the reason you press it open is that when you do the next fold, you get a really nice sharp fold, and the original stitch line is right on the fold. So now with this one here, we can, our second row of stitching, we can line the stitching up with this first row here. Now it says quarter here, and that row there is a 1/4 inch, which is 6 millimeters. So the other thing you can do too, if you find it easier, is just to line it up with the edge of the foot here too. It'll just depend on how whether you've been really precise with your original row of stitching. So there's our second row of stitching, and the seam's finished. And so now I don't have any little hairy bits hanging out. If I did, you could just, actually there's one there, so that's pulled out. Yeah, and so now we'll just press the seam to one side, usually to the back of the garment, and then that's your French seam done.
And Mark, that's usually only lightweight fabrics.
Yeah, exactly. Good point, Debbie. I've seen people doing French seams in denim, and really it just makes it really bulky and lumpy. Don't be afraid to overlock seams. Like a French seams, it seems to be one of those things that people get in their heads that a French seam is a good finish, and it is, but it also only relates to certain types of fabrics and certain garments. So, have a chat with your lecturer or your technician to see whether it's going to be relevant to the garment that you're making as well, because sometimes it's just not necessary to go to all that trouble.